Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Stephen Methven and I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, it is so nice to finally meet you. I feel like I've worked with you for a long time and not actually said anything in person to you before.
True, it is indeed an absolute pleasure to share the limelight with you for the first time, Stephen, but hopefully not for the last time.
Thanks very much for coming on. Coming up later tonight, Starmer wants to repair relations with Europe. The COVID inquiry have slammed Hancock and Hunt in their first report. And we'll be sharing a very interesting interview by Jeremy Scahill with the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 5 climate change activists have received the longest prison sentences for peaceful protest in British history. On the far right of the picture, Extinction Rebellion founder Roger Hallam was given a 5-year sentence for conspiring to cause a public nuisance. Pictured from the left of the photo, Lucia Whitaker-Dabru, Cressida Gethin, Louise Lancaster, and Daniel Shaw were each given 4-year sentences. The 5 were sentenced for taking part in, and wait for it, a Zoom call. The call was set up to recruit activists for a Just Stop Oil action that took place on the M25 in 2022, causing several hours of gridlock on the motorway. But for context, the average sentence for violent crime is 1.7 years. For criminal damage, it's 2.4 years. And these guys got sentenced to 4 years, or even 5 years in the case of Hallam. In handing down the sentences, Judge Christopher Heer said this: "I acknowledge that at least some of the concerns are shared by many. But the plain fact is that each of you has some time ago crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic." Just Stop Oil has described the sentences as a, quote, obscene perversion of justice. The 2.5-week trial that preceded the sentencing was described by The Guardian as the UK's wildest climate trial. And it is indeed pretty wild to see 5 people get lengthy prison sentences for merely planning what was essentially a peaceful protest. Helena, what do you make of this?
I mean, if anything, the name of the conviction itself should tell you just how ridiculous this is. The fact that the name of the conviction is conspiracy to commit a public nuisance, and that is 5 years of jail time in one of these cases here, is quite frankly absolutely obscene. In any kind of functioning country want to call themselves a democracy. It's been clear from the outset, from this conservative piece of legislation that was used for this conviction and for the sentencing guidelines that it's had written down on it, is part of a broader authoritarian desire from the right wing in this country to crack down on peaceful, this is indeed peaceful protest that is being cracked down upon here. It's really important that we understand this. When you look at things like, I think El Folan posted this on Twitter just now, when you look at the average sentences for things like drug crime or violent crime or robbery, the average sentence for these are all lower than the average sentence that's been handed out to Just Stop All activists over this particular conviction of conspiracy to commit public nuisance by, again, sitting in a Zoom call. Funny that the Zoom call was infiltrated by a journalist from The Sun. Of course, the Murdoch papers are always there trying to ensure that all opposition to the continuation of us hurtling towards the climate crisis might be cracked down upon by the state. Now, whatever you think about Just Stop Oil's tactics, whatever you think about their tactics, I personally massively disagree with what Just Stop Oil do. I think it erodes trust in the pro-climate movement. I think that they have spent too much time irritating general members of the public rather than engaging in something something that is much more targeted towards the people who are generally involved in what is going on in terms of our problems with the climate crisis. Regardless whether you disagree with their tactics or not, you cannot say that this is a fair sentence that's what's been given here. You cannot say, indeed, I don't think in terms of peaceful protest in any situation can warrant something like a prison sentence. It's even more ridiculous to be handing down 4-year prison sentences for people, again, for conspiring to commit public nuisance in the name of peaceful protest, is in any way justified when we literally have a crisis where the prisons are full to the point at which we have to release tens of thousands of prisoners early, probably rightfully. In some cases, they're on kind of non-violent offences that probably shouldn't have been criminalised in the first place, or at least handed down prison sentences. But at a time in which so much time, so much energy and breath is being spent on talking about the crisis in terms of overcrowding in our prisons, to hand down such authoritarian and draconian sentences to people, and again call them things like moving across from concerned people to fanaticists, or to fanatics was the wording, I think, of the judge, when clearly the issue, of course, is there is broad public consent for a change of direction on climate change that the government have been failing to acquiesce to. And in fact, with no mandate, had completely U-turned on under Rishi Sunak, given that they got elected on a mandate of achieving net zero under Boris Johnson in 2019, when, of course, all these protests were committed before the election, quite a way back. It was 2022, I believe. And so the only option people had for these very grave concerns over the future of climate change were being completely unlistened to by every other legitimate form of interaction other than protest. So this is clearly, because this sentence, this was created as part of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, I believe, or the Public Order Bill even, sorry, was essentially tailor-made specifically to try and crack down on Just Stop Oil and insulate Britain as an organisation. So it's clear that this is very spiteful policy that was passed by the Conservatives. And of course, Labour have said that they're not going to repeal it either. So more of this to come.
Yeah, I think there will probably be more of this to come. And just on that bit that you mentioned about the Sun journalist who infiltrated the Zoom call, according to my colleague Claire Heimer, who wrote this story up for NovaraMedia.com, the police allowed that journalist to come along with them to the arrest of Roger Hallam. Now, I can't verify that, but if that's true, it just really does show that the Sun is the cop newspaper. The European Political Community Summit has kicked off at Blenheim Palace. It's an annual meeting of heads of state from 44 countries across Europe, including many that aren't in the EU, including us. And it's a pretty new forum established in 2022 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Its remit is to discuss cooperation on issues like migration, economic policy, and of course, security, all under the umbrella of Europe's future. And Britain's future with Europe was one of the topics of Keir Starmer's opening speech. He began with a reference to one of Blenheim Palace's most famous sons.
It is, of course, the birthplace of Winston Churchill, and we stand for the values that he embodies around the world. Liberty and democracy, yes, of course, but also defiance and resolve in their defence. And today, as a new storm gathers over our continent, we choose to meet it in that same spirit, and we choose to meet it together. And that is the choice of the government that I lead, now 2 weeks old. We want to work with all of you to reset relationships, rediscover our common interest, and renew the bonds of trust and friendship that brighten the fabric of European life.
Now, that reference to renewing the UK's relationship with Europe will doubtless have raised the hackles of some or even many on the right. However, Foreign Secretary David Lammy said the UK is, quote, nowhere near negotiating agreements with the EU. Elsewhere in his speech, Starmer also talked about cooperation with European countries on immigration, on border security, and law enforcement. He also stressed their joint responsibility to tackle what he called the root causes of migration: extreme poverty, conflict, and climate change. And just before our show tonight, Starmer announced an £84 million of additional humanitarian support in Africa and the Middle East as part of his strategy on migration. But the central cause of the summit was military security against the perceived threat of Russia. Joining Starmer on stage was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Starmer addressed these remarks to him.
And the task is urgent because our security is on the line. Every day, Ukraine fights to protect not just the Ukrainian people, but the European people, a continent where our belief in freedom, democracy, and the rule of law was hard won, and that wants to live in peace. So, President Zelensky, in your struggle to uphold those values, we salute you once again. Have no doubt we will stand with you for as long as it takes.
Now, it's more than a little interesting that Starmer made that unlimited pledge on behalf of the people of Europe, because just yesterday, Germany announced its plans to halve its military aid to Ukraine next year, slashing it from 8 billion to 4 billion euros. Germany is the second biggest donor to Ukraine after the US. And it was the spectre of a November presidential win by Donald Trump that loomed over the meeting, with European leaders fearful that he'll cut or even end US support to Ukraine if he regains the White House. Now, Zelensky also made a speech saying this.
We must act as brave as necessary to achieve results. We can steer this war towards its just ending with the power of our weapons and our diplomacy, and we should not fear these capabilities. The more effective our air defense is, the more helpless Putin will be. The fewer restrictions we have on the use of effective weapons, the more Russia will seek peace. Military airfields from which Russian jets take off with bombs against our cities, our people, our children, and the launch sites of Russian missiles, all these must be destroyed. This will not only eliminate some targets, but will also reduce Russia's capability to continue this war.
That seems a clear call there from Zelensky for greater leniency when it comes to using weapons provided by European allies to hit targets deeper inside Russia, a prospect that some say would risk widening rather than resolving this conflict. Helena, this summit only lasts about a day. I read one journalist describe it as political speed dating. What's the point of the meeting?
Well, at the end of the day, their first thing is that it's not going to be there for them to be discussing policy in detail. You need to meet up and fly to a summit to be able to discuss policy in detail with people. We have phones, we have telecommunications. That's not what this is for. What it really is for, it's for optics. It's so they can have their speeches, they can have their time in the limelight to be able to use as a platform, as a pedestal, to be able to discuss these issues more broadly for the people that they are speaking to, either whether it be in their own country or within other countries. This one in particular, though, specifically is under the auspices of the fact that support across Europe, especially, maybe less so in the UK, but definitely across Europe, as you've seen with Germany's switch in policy, there is far less support for this continual usage of public money towards helping finance the war in Ukraine by sending military aid to the Ukrainian military. And so, in the context of this kind of political disenfranchisement, clearly plenty of people in Europe are still feeling the pinch of this happening at the same time as they've seen the pandemic also hit public finances as well. This was never going to last very long. And so in the absence of broad popular support for it, or in waning popular support for it, you need to have some kind of moment to say, look, here is our unified front. Here is me standing next to Volodymyr Zelensky saying, well, if you don't help us with all of these different goals that we have in mind in terms of how much aid that Ukraine needs to continue the conflict or to be able to resist the Russian aggression, for example, or indeed by wanting to appeal to people across borders and say, well, actually, we would like to have more ability to use this, for example, to hit targets across the border in Russia, something obviously everyone should be massively opposed to because that could be deemed to be escalatory. By actually having this optically seen through this kind of this summit, this supposed idea that we have this summit full of people coming together to be at this really important moment of political unity, that is, again, optically useful. It may not be useful to be able to actually hammer out the finer points of policy in the background, but using these positions, the elevated position that you have of speaking alongside each other can help foment that across borders. I believe that's what their goal is. Of course, whether or not that's going to be successful, we're going to have to wait and see.
The COVID inquiry has issued its first report assessing the UK's preparedness for a global pandemic, and it is damning. This was inquiry chair Baroness Heather Hallett summarising her findings.
In 2019, it was widely believed in the United Kingdom and abroad that the UK was not only properly prepared, but was one of the best prepared countries in the world to respond to a pandemic. This belief was dangerously mistaken. In reality, the UK was ill prepared for dealing with the whole system civil emergency of a pandemic, let alone the coronavirus pandemic that actually struck. In 2020, the UK lacked resilience. Going into the pandemic, there'd been a slowdown in health improvement and health inequalities had widened. High pre-existing levels of heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness and obesity, and general levels of ill health and health inequalities meant the UK was more vulnerable. Public services, particularly health and social care, were running close to, if not beyond, capacity in normal times.
Health inequalities widening, public services overstretched, and the NHS operating beyond capacity. In other words, a decade of conservative austerity created the ideal conditions for the COVID pandemic to take the heavy toll it did on the UK. But it wasn't austerity alone that led to the UK's chaotic response to the virus. One political failure after another meant the country was in no position to respond to the threat of a pandemic. Hallett gave this example in her summary.
One of the first lines of defence to a pandemic is containment. And this requires a system of test, trace and isolate that can be rapidly scaled up to meet the demands of a major outbreak. This did not exist in the United Kingdom when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The UK government's sole pandemic strategy from 2011 was outdated and lacked adaptability. It was never, in fact, properly tested. The UK government neither applied it nor adapted it, and the doctrine that underpinned it was ultimately abandoned, as was the 2011 strategy itself. I have no hesitation in concluding that the processes, planning, and policy of the civil contingency structures across the United Kingdom failed the citizens of all four nations.
Now, Hallett didn't just blame structures, processes, and plans. This is her view of the response of ministers to the pandemic. Ministers and officials were guilty of groupthink that led to a false consensus that the UK was well prepared for a pandemic. Never again can a disease be allowed to lead to so many deaths and so much suffering. Hallett named individuals too, holding Health Secretaries Jeremy Hunt and Matt Hancock responsible for failing to fix flaws in the contingency planning of the Health Department. That plan hadn't been updated since 2011, and Hancock is accused of abandoning it as soon as the pandemic hit. This is what Hallett said about the previous Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Ministers and officials concerned with emergency preparedness, resilience, and response should have a better understanding of this specialist field, not just during emergencies, but also in between them. They must immerse themselves in the topic, understand it, and ask questions about it. There are a great number of ministers who could have done more by asking questions. Mr. Hunt accepted that, collectively, we didn't put anything like the time and effort and energy into understanding the dangers of pathogens or challenging the consensus. The inquiry agrees. Hallett's report also makes 10 recommendations to prevent future pandemic response failures, including these. First, each government should create a single cabinet-level or equivalent ministerial committee, including the senior minister responsible for health and social care, responsible for whole system civil emergency preparedness and resilience, to be chaired by the leader or deputy leader of the relevant government. A new UK-wide whole system civil emergency strategy should be put in place, and it should be subject to a substantive reassessment at least every 3 years. And the UK government and devolved administrations should hold a UK-wide pandemic response exercise at least every 3 years. Now, some of the families of those who died of COVID are not entirely convinced that Hallett's recommendations go far enough. Speaking at London's COVID Memorial Wall, one relative and health worker, Dr. Saleha Ahsan, told Sky News this.
The one thing that really hit home today was how I and other healthcare workers and the bereaved really don't have a voice in this inquiry. And that really hit me today. And I'll tell you why that hit me today. Because I had to go up to someone in the inquiry, give them my name, and they had to check whether my name was on a list. Now, my name shouldn't have to be on a list. I qualify because I worked during the pandemic. I lost my dad during the pandemic in the second wave when we should have known better. The first wave, yes, we know from the outcome today of what Baroness Hallett has told us. She's told us what we already knew, frankly, that we weren't prepared. She's given us 10 points. Thankfully, she looked at inequalities. That was a point that we had to push, our lawyers had to push, the team had to push to make sure that deaths according to inequalities was in there. And I'm glad to say it was. We made it in there. But it was no surprise. I've worked in areas that suffered some of the highest death rates in East London previously in my career. And that was 10 years worth of working in emergency medicine in these areas where you saw crowding. I make films, and I've been making films about the challenges within the NHS caused by austerity for years. So we had nothing left in the tank by the time COVID hit. But again, that's nothing that surprised any of us. So why it's surprising some, I just don't know.
The COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group also doesn't think Hallett's report goes far enough. A spokesperson said this: "While the inquiry has diagnosed much of what undermined our response, Lady Hallett has not gone far enough in setting out how we can challenge, address, and improve inequalities and capacity of public services, as opposed to just understanding the effects of these failures. We ask for this government to produce a plan to address health inequalities and in its first 100 days conduct a cross-departmental audit into pandemic preparedness. We are also calling for the government to establish a Minister for Resilience and Preparedness. We need someone with ultimate responsibility for an emergency response who we can hold to account." Also speaking at the memorial was Trade Unions Congress rep Nathan Oswin.
Today's report tells the story of a decade. It's a story many of us know, many of us have experienced, many of us have felt direct effects from. It sets out some of those consequences as well. It's a story of underinvestment in our public services. It's a story of fragmentation across our public health. It's a story of poor, short-term decision-making that has failed the people of this country. Those who lost loved ones, those frontline workers who risked every single day to go into work and protect others, were failed. It's as simple as that in this report, and it makes it clear. The challenge now is to ensure that the lessons are learnt, the mistakes are never repeated, and that our public services are supported.
There's been some political reaction to the report too. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said this: "The pandemic showed us that the backbone of Britain is made up of those committing their lives to service. Key workers like carers, nurses, paramedics, cleaners, and teachers. They put themselves in the eye of the storm, and together with people up and down the country, many of them lost their lives or are still living with the impact of the virus. Today's report confirms what many have always believed, that the UK was underprepared for COVID-19 and that process, planning and policy across all 4 nations failed UK citizens." Hallett's report today is just the first of 9 that we're expecting to come out of the COVID inquiry. Future reports will cover core UK and devolved government decision-making, the impact of the pandemic on the NHS and care services, and procurement procedures for PPE, ventilators, and oxygen. I can think of a few people who might be sweating over that one. If today's report is anything to go by, those are likely to be pretty critical of the last Tory government. Helena, what do you think the impact of this first report is going to be? And has it gone far enough?
In terms of the scope of how far it's gone, I think I would echo the sentiments of the people that we heard in those clips previously discussing the full impact and the full kind of solutions that we would have to the problems that have been identified in the first report would be an extra step that would be necessary. But hopefully we'll see more discussion of those in all of the future reports that are to come. There's obviously plenty more to see in terms of how we respond to the findings of the COVID inquiry. As for the actual impact of this first report, surely there's 2 things that it must do. First of all, it must foment anti-austerity politics completely within the public psyche. Austerity especially has probably got to be the biggest cause of the problems that we have now, and George Osborne and David Cameron are certainly the biggest culprits when it comes to our lack of preparedness for a pandemic at the very, very least. And the second thing that it must do is it must consign the Conservative Party out of government for generations, because it is clear that it's not just some kind of artifact of just who was in charge. All of Conservative philosophy up until this point shows us that that's what their role as a political party was always going to lead us to. The Conservative Party has never, ever cared about the role of governance. Governance is something that they are not there for. They are there to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to win elections. At no point in the entirety of the history of the Conservative Party, at least 1979 onwards, have they ever thought that maybe they should be doing something that's in the public good rather than in the personal good. I think this speaks to why Starmer is so clear when he's been making speeches about government as an acts of public service. Because at least, whether or not you disagree with Starmer, he's at least different in terms of the Conservative Party, whose singular role is to win every single election, regardless of whether or not that it has many adverse consequences on sectors of the population. And we see this in terms of how austerity politics completely left us completely open to have our healthcare service and all of our other services destroyed by something that we weren't clearly not prepared for, and the government clearly had not made preparations for, outside of the fact that so many parts of our health services have been degraded by the fact that healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP dropped every single year from 2010 until 2018. And those same failures in terms of the role of governance continued throughout all of the people who were in charge of the administration whilst the pandemic was going on as well. Hancock and Hunt, of course, people like that, as well as Johnson and all of the others as well. So there are plenty of people who have gigantic failures upon this. The question, of course, is how do you take all of that information that we now have from the inquiry and then make political hay out of it? Obviously, Starmer's initial response did talk a lot of good things about how it changed our view of people who actually worked as key workers. People who previously would have been dismissed as being unskilled workers were clearly the backbone of our economy, and always have been, but especially so during a pandemic. But did he mention austerity in his response? It didn't seem like he would do. And one of the key reasons why austerity and conservative ideology has led to the degradation of the public sector so that it couldn't cope with the pandemic, even outside of the reduction in spending on keeping these departments open, the reduction in capital investment on ensuring that we had the capacity needed to deal with an increase in people having to use, for example, the healthcare service at a time when we were trying to flatten the curve because of our lack of capacity. The reason why we're in this position is because that capitalist ideology specifically prioritizes efficiency over contingency. Rather than spending money that we don't need to, because that would be inefficient, quote unquote. We always hear about this. Oh, we need to get rid of all of these inefficiencies in the healthcare service. What that leads you to is a position where you have no contingency in terms of capacity to deal with the new influx of people when something happens, when some kind of disaster happens, and you need that contingency there to save money in the short term. It then costs you so much more money and real human cost in the long term and erodes public trust in government. We also saw this, for example, that's a very similar kind of dynamic that we saw with the shipping during the pandemic. They were all operating at maximum efficiency. Something gets in the way and the whole system breaks down. The problem, of course, is what we heard from the Labour Party in terms of their approach to how they're going to be investing in the healthcare service. Wes Streeting has been very, very clear that he wants to make the service more efficient and not have to spend extra money. In fact, massively go against this idea that the NHS themselves expect more money to go in. They come out with the begging bowl, I think was his phrase that they were using, and they couldn't pour more money into a leaky bucket. This is the exact kind of rhetoric that we had from the Conservative government. Darren Jones has been very similar in also making the same kind of points in terms of making efficiency savings. And of course, not only were efficiency savings never found during the Cameron years, all that led to was a reduction in service provision. It's also led to the same precarious position of a healthcare service that the Labour Party have inherited right now. So without there being a future plan for massively increasing capital and also day-to-day expenditure into NHS services, we are going to continue having a service that isn't going to be well prepared enough and well invested enough in to have the contingency to deal with a pandemic in future. And that is worrying.
Yeah, it's very, very worrying. And I have another question for you about that. So in her report, Hallett doesn't mention austerity either, like Keir Starmer. But it's very clear that the impact on people of the Tories' essentially homicidal policies meant that more people, well, it sort of makes it so urgent to repair things like health inequalities and so forth, not just to prepare ourselves for a pandemic, but also just for the sake of justice. Do you think there's any facts, anything that would impress upon Starmer, Reeves, Streeting, the urgency of repairing the impacts of those conservative policies on the British public, rather than having to wait for growth to get us to a point where maybe there'll be some ameliorative effect?
Well, the ironic thing, of course, is that these are all pro-growth policies. I've described the way in which the Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer talk about this idea of using growth to fund public services as like expecting a plant to grow before you water it. Like, you need to put the money in to be able to create the conditions for growth to be available. One of the big kind of hamperings of growth over the last 14 years or so has been our kind of slump in productivity, our slump in healthcare outcomes that has massively reduced our labour force participation rate, for example. We've all seen the massive increase in the welfare bill because of people being on long-term sick. And that the pandemic has contributed to this, as has all of the austerity effects in terms of our healthcare service. You've got to remember, the healthcare service waiting lists were massively increasing even before the pandemic started, which is essentially indirectly due to what George Osborne was doing. And of course, if you don't have healthy people able to work and be productive, you won't be able to get the growth that you need. Right? There is a very, very large justification for engaging in deficit spending right now in capital investment in the NHS, large scale capital investment, and of course, short term day-to-day spending in terms of ensuring that we have the workforce problem is addressed in terms of dealing with the retention problem, which you'll need to be able to strike a deal with doctors to be able to increase their pay enough so they don't go to other countries. This is the same in terms of teaching as well. Teachers are really struggling to make ends meet in this country because their pay is massively lagged behind other private sectors. There's an economic effect called the Baumol effect, which describes how wages in certain public sectors that don't have the same individual productivity gains as the private sector, they increase their pay based upon what they could get in the private sector, for example. And that hasn't been adhered to by the Conservative government because of things like austerity and public sector pay freezes. If you want to have an economic growth in your economy, having a well-educated population is good for that. And unless you actually engage in a large-scale repairing of our schools where roofs are collapsing because of all of this removal of funds for things like school renovation projects. Rishi Sunak was directly to blame for that in his position as Chancellor. Again, we're not going to get the growth that we need. So even if you take away all the humanitarian concerns, all the utilitarian concerns of what actually happens to people that obviously we care a lot about, even if you look through the single stated goal of the Labour Party and government, their central mission is to get the biggest growth in the G7, or the largest sustained growth in the G7. You are not going to do that unless you fix public services. And waiting for growth to happen before you do that means you're just going to continue an austerity cycle forever.
But fiscal rules, Helena, and OBR brainworms mean that none of that is going to happen, I suspect. In the West, we hear plenty from one side of the war in Gaza. Our television screens and newspapers have been full of statements from Israeli government officials, either justifying their assault on Gaza or denying its severity. Occasionally, we hear statements from Hamas, but we almost never hear directly from their leaders or the leaders of other Palestinian resistance movements. That means that certain images of the resistance are allowed to take hold in the Western imagination, images of chaos and inhumanity. And more than 20 years of war on terror conditioning about the Middle East and Islam has made people in the West highly receptive to those messages. And that's why a new interview from Jeremy Scahill, formerly of The Intercept, but now at Dropsite, is so important. He sat down with one of Palestinian Islamic Jihad's leaders, Mohammed al-Hindi, who told him that, amongst other things, the Oslo Accords are over. So, who are Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Well, they were founded in 1981 under the belief that only armed struggle could achieve freedom from Israel's subjugation of Palestinians. PIJ is the second largest armed Palestinian resistance after Hamas and has engaged in 30 years of paramilitary warfare against Israel. At times, this has included suicide bombings against Israeli civilians and military targets. It's been a proscribed group in the UK since 2001. Mohammed al-Hindi is the group's second highest ranked official and chief negotiator. Here, he explains the group's origins to Scahill. In the early stages of its establishment, our movement tried to develop its own vision and understanding before engaging in active fighting against Israel. A vision of the political reality, understanding the Islamic world and the region's history. So it started as an intellectual discussion before it took up arms. Ultimately, however, its analysis was that the project of establishing Israel was a Western one. The West had its issues with the Jews. In short, it could be said that anti-Semitism is a European problem that did not exist in the East. It was solved, however, at the expense of the Palestinian people and the region. The Zionist project is not about the Jews in the first place. Rather, it is a Western colonization project that aims to control the region and preclude its independence and development. This is the Zionist project at heart. We do not have any problem with the Jews per se. Rather, our problem is with Zionism as a racist movement which was based on usurping our resources and homeland and displacing us in 1948. This was the founding political vision upon which Islamic Jihad movement was established. In a later part of the interview, Al-Hindi reaffirms that thought, telling Scahill that PIJ's problem is not with Jews or Americans, but with injustice. Scahill also asked Al-Hindi about PIJ's participation in the October 7th attack. Al-Hindi says this: Hamas, or more accurately, Al-Qassam, were getting prepared for Al-Aqsa flood, and no one knew about it. A day earlier, on October 6th, we in Islamic Jihad had a celebration of the anniversary of the Islamic Jihad movement. Thousands took part in the celebration, and we were taken by surprise like everybody else. However, very shortly after learning about the flood, we engaged in this battle. It was our duty as a resistance movement to confront the aggression immediately. Al-Hindi was also asked about the taking of civilian captives on October 7th. Like Hamas leaders, Al-Hindi described their capture as, quote, by mistake, after Palestinians not involved in the operation began taking Israelis back to Gaza. PIJ continues to hold an unknown number of Israelis in Gaza. Scahill went on to ask Al-Hindi how he thought history would record the events of October 7th. This was his answer. A huge strategic failure for Israel on October the 7th at all levels, the political, military, and intelligence. It was also a failure for the protectors of Israel. The 9 months that followed were just more failure because they committed crimes against civilians, destroyed Gaza, employed the starvation policy. All those add to the military and moral failure. Israel's image has been damaged. The image of victimization which it sold to the world for years is over. It has become a wanted criminal. So Israel has lost at the level of its image and narrative and at the moral level. Further, the army has not achieved any of its objectives and has been exhausted. So those successive months have only been more failure at all levels: military, political, moral, and in terms of Israel's image. Asked what PIJ's position on the two-state solution is, Al-Hindi said this: This is not a realistic question. It's not as though anything depends on this question. Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords and accepted the two-state solution, and he was the head of the PLO. He signed on its behalf. 31 years later, the lands on which the Palestinian state was supposed to be established have become the second Israel. They have become a state for settlers. It seems that a two-state solution was about the first state of Israel of 1948 and the second Israel in 1967. Some journalists ask about the position of Islamic Jihad of a two-state solution. But no one asks the Israeli parties who constitute the government and are members in the Knesset and who are calling for eliminating the Palestinian cause and displacing the Palestinian people in whole, calling for a transfer while being in the Zionist decision-making position. So we object to putting the Palestinian people to a test by asking what is the position of the factions on the two-state solution. This is not logical. So as a matter of principle, I believe we are in a national liberation stage which requires resistance. When there is a partner willing to solve the Palestinian issue, whether in Israel or the West, especially the United States, only then they can talk. Now, however, talking of a two-state solution offers the Palestinian people mere illusions, as though the US administration and the West are keen on the two-state solution. The American wizard has just pulled this out from their pocket to throw it against Al-Aqsa flood. That's all. Now, I thought this was a really interesting and important piece of journalism. But of course, we should read this interview as critically as we'd read any other with a political figure fighting for a cause. But unfortunately, you can't be critical of it or read it critically because it's the type of interview that Western media does very little to provide. Helena, is it just me, or does it seem like there are some ideas that in the West we're discouraged from trying to get our heads around?
Oh, 100%. The framing is incredibly dishonest. If a lot of motivations, a lot of end goals, a lot of members of the Palestinian military armed wings, and of course their political affiliations as well. Of course, it was also important to point out that clearly any of the representatives of these people, they always have incredibly strong message discipline. It was very interesting. I read through the Dropsite News article today, and a lot of the times in the interview, whenever things like the actions of what Al-Quds or Al-Qassam get up to is ever brought into question, the message is always essentially turned around to the idea that we've heard a lot of times from people like Ghazi Hamad from Hamas talking about things, well, how can you blame us for what we do when Israel has done to us what it has done. And I'm like, I agree that, what Israel has done is terrible, but that can't give you justification for doing your own war crimes in response. But nevertheless, there's two kind of really large parts of dishonest framing around this issue. And one of the biggest ones is that there's a lot of framing in Western media that when you discuss people like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, when you discuss Hamas, their intentions are, they give the idea that their intentions are religious or ethnic in nature. And this isn't true. This isn't true. Of course, in the article itself, the man from Palestinian Islamic Jihad specifically says, well, actually, we call ourselves Islamic Jihad because it's within the Islamic tradition of the Palestinian people, but we're not trying to form some kind of Islamic state or whatever it is in the land of Palestine. This is a territorial dispute. Like, there's a reason why the propaganda piece from Western outlets has been to call things like, describe Hamas and PIJ as being like ISIS, because ISIS wanted to have this expansionary policy towards creating a larger caliphate. But of course, Hamas and PIJ have no interest in that kind of thing. Their interest is in Palestinian nationalism. That is their guiding principle. And of course, their Islamic beliefs is what underpins that main focus of both their ideology and their geopolitical and military goals, which is Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian statehood. And of course, there is also in that article a lot of amenity to the 1967 borders as a state that it would be acceptable to them. But of course, as has been eloquently said there, that isn't on the table. The idea that the Oslo process was going to create a Palestinian state, when there was mutual letters of recognition, that led to the creation of the state of Israel, recognized in terms of the Fatah in the West Bank. They recognized the state of Israel. Did you get a recognition of a Palestinian state in return? No. All it led to was the Bantustanization of the areas with regards to like areas A, B, and C within the West Bank. And as has been rightly said there, just further encroachment, further settlement, further stealing of territory. And there is no honest negotiating partner on the Israeli side, which is the material basis for the reason why there has been resistance to that occupation, again, which is, of course, 100% legal under international law, as long as you're attacking military targets, which is obviously the problem with what we've seen over the last kind of 9 months or so, or at least on October the 7th during Al-Aqsa flood. And one last thing as well is that one other piece of Western propaganda that you hear a lot of the time is this idea that Palestinian groups want to eliminate Jewish people from the area of Palestine. And as we've seen both in this article and in other statements that have been made by other leaders as well, this isn't true. There's a quote from Al-Hindi in this particular article where he says, even if Netanyahu were to climb upon the minaret of Al-Aqsa and declare himself a Muslim, this wouldn't be a solution. Because at the end of the day, it's about the rights of the Palestinians to statehood, their right to return to their homeland, of which they were expelled from after the Nakba in 1948, and their right to live in their own level of security and without having to continually be under the occupation of the state of Israel. And that is, of course, the key driver of the conflict. And when it comes to a future state that they might envision, like a single state solution that many people on the left have advocated for, obviously, Al-Hindi says we would happily live in a Palestinian state across the area of Palestine with as many Jewish people that wanted to live there, whether they were from the East or from the West, as long as they are amenable to it not being an ethnic state. And I even read a translation of an Arabic interview that Hamas Politburo member Osama Hamdan gave. So this is an Arabic language. This wasn't them trying to message towards Western audiences because, of course, they have a previous history of, I guess, whitewashing some of their views when they want to make it appear more palatable to Western audiences. This was an Arabic language interviewing they were giving, and he specifically made the case. He was saying, well, when we create a unitary state of Palestine, if that's something that happens in future, we would happily live amongst plenty of Jewish people. We just want to ensure that there is not, an Israeli ethnic state on that territory, and it's a unified state of Palestine that Palestinians can return home to. So this framing of this issue as being, as Islam versus Judaism, or, Arabs versus ethnic Jewish people, is incorrect, at least in terms of the motivations of the Palestinians. Because, of course, the main motivator of the reasons why Palestinians have never been given the right to return, why the one-state solution is never on the cards, is because there is because the Israeli state necessitates there must be a Jewish majority. And therefore, a one-state solution is never on the cards in terms of the Israeli negotiating side. And that is the problem. One side wants an ethno state and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, there's another part of that interview where he explicitly talks about a one-state solution. And he says, why is no one talking about a one-state solution in which there are equal rights for all who live in it? And it is interesting that nobody in the West is talking about such a solution. Okay, I think we're going to be leaving it there. Thank you, Helena, so much for joining me tonight. It's been great.
As always, a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, everyone, for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.